Jmenuji se Martin Bednář a naučím vás prodávat víc. Jak vyjednávat v B2B prodeji? Jen Newall.
If someone were to say to me, hey, help me, I'm going into a negotiation now. In half an hour I'm going to be negotiating. Give me one thing I need to know. I would say, use if, which means never give anything away unless you get something in return. If you use the word if, it forces you to actually say. So if your sentence has if in it, so if you do that, we'll do this. And as soon as you start using if, you get those trades. But also the back of the mind must think,
Jmenuji se Martin Bednář a naučím vás prodávat víc. Stáhněte si 3 checklisty, které vám pomohou prodat víc. Přihlašte se na online trénink Akcelerace B2B prodeje. Link najdete na mém webu a na mém blogu martinbednar.net. Jmenuji se Martin Bednář a naučím vás prodávat víc.
Dobrý den, vážení posluchači, dobrý den, vážení diváci. Mám dnes pro vás vzácného hosta Jana Newalla. Jan je člověk, který je velmi zkušený vyjednavač, učil vyjednávání na několika univerzitách a samozřejmě vyjednává pro spoustu korporací, pro spoustu firemních vyjednávání a na začátku 90. let pomáhal s vyjednáváním při předávání vlády z vlády apartheidu demokraticky zvolené vládě, kde se účastnil stovky a stovky vyjednávání. Budeme se spolu bavit v angličtině. So let's switch to English. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you, Martin.
I just introduced you and I introduced your negotiation accomplishments. And the reason why I invited you for today's interview is that we can read many articles and even books about negotiation where it's written how it's important to have a great strategy and preparation and this kind of stuff, but they are very general. So I would like to discuss with you the specifics. What does it mean, strategy and so on? So my first question is, if you have a look at the negotiation process, ideally in the business or B2B context, what are the basic steps in this kind of negotiation?
In a negotiation strategy, well, it might sound very simplistic, but the key thing is that the negotiation strategy must mirror the company strategy. So what, we need to ask ourselves when we're negotiating, what is the company trying to achieve? Now, for example, if the company is trying to get into a new sector, which you've not been into before, they might be prepared to forego certain things in other areas. For example, they might be able to be prepared to go in a lower price in order to get a foothold in a new sector. So it's fundamental in that way, in the sense that, and I think that sometimes sellers, sales managers or project managers or whatever they are, sometimes get so involved in the negotiation itself that they forget about the bigger picture of where they're going. So I think that's one of the key things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, that's important to have the negotiation strategy in harmony with the corporate strategy. And if I have that already, or if I have the corporate strategy in mind, and I have a customer here who tells me that I need to give him a very big discount, let's say 50% or whatever, and I need to prepare for this kind of negotiation. What are the steps in the negotiation process? Let's dissect them into like 3, 4, 5 basic steps, and then let's have a detailed look at each of them.
If we're talking about a business negotiation, because in other negotiations, it doesn't necessarily happen that there's any selling involved. But in a business negotiation, there must be some selling that happens. Now, if the selling has been successful, if it's been well done, the negotiation will be easier because the seller would have built the value for their solution with the customer or potential customer. So that we have, for example, the worst possible situation is to be into a one issue negotiation, and that one issue will be price. And in my book, that's not even negotiation, that's called haggling. It's just, we're just arguing about the price. We should be able to negotiate. We need to be able to trade one thing against another. So what are the things we can trade? Now that depends on what we've sold to the customer. And if the customer values one thing, they'll be prepared to trade that against something else. So it's very important that the selling is done well before the negotiation happens. The seller should be aware of negotiation right from the first contact with the customer. Because if the customer says, for example, in the first meeting, look, this is a project, this is what we want to do, and we have to have it finished by the end of the year. The seller, this little bell should start ringing there, end of the year. Okay, this is critical because there's all that's going to create pressure to settle earlier. Maybe the customer's prepared to pay to finish by the end of the year. So we're starting to think about those sort of things and how we can trade them. I always say, if you read any book on negotiation, it will say to you how important it is to ask questions, because generally you're controlling the conversation by asking questions, gives you more power and so on. But asking questions gives you information, and there's information there that you really need. Most people are not aware of the name Rudyard Kipling these days. He was a British poet from colonial times, fallen out of favor now. But one thing Rudyard Kipling did was he wrote some stories which became the Jungle Book, and everybody knows the Jungle Book. So those are based on Rudyard Kipling's stories. So Rudyard Kipling wrote this little piece of doggerel poetry. He said, "I kept me 6 wives serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what, why, and when, and where, and how, and who." So those are all the questions you need to ask. But probably the most important question is the why question. Why is it that you need this by the end of the year? Why is it that you need this and not that? Because the more we understand of the why, the more we understand of what lies behind that, and we can come up with more creative solutions. And yet we know, because when we observe people negotiating, the question they ask the least is the why question. So it's the one we need to ask, and it's the one we forget to ask. So we need to ask why, which is not necessarily, children will say, why this, why that, why that, and it becomes very annoying. But we can ask why in different ways. You could say why, or you could say, can you explain that to me? Or I'd like to understand that better, or whatever it is. So we get to know what's behind that. And the more we understand of what's behind it, what Fisher and Urey call the interests of the other side, the more we can structure proposals that are going to meet their interests and ours. And we get that mythical thing called the win-win solution.
If you could divide negotiation process into a couple of steps, like 3, 4, 5 steps, what steps would there be?
Now let's assume it's a business negotiation and some selling has taken place. So we'll put that one aside for the moment. Then we get into a situation where we're getting ready. Let's call it getting ready to negotiate. Call it preparation and planning, or whatever you want to call it. But there's getting ready. What do we do before we go into the room, whether it's a real room or a virtual room? Now that we're into the room, hopefully we've done our research and we've got a lot of information already. But once we're in there and we're face to face, whether virtually or in a real room, we're now talking to the other side, and we now are in a situation where we can ask for information. So we can clarify, is the information we've got correct? Do we need to change it? And also there must be things that we don't know and we want to check out. And the more we can find out, the better. Now, some of the information they won't give us, but we should ask for it anyway, because we do know that people tend to, and this is something that researched in North America, that most people don't lie in negotiation, but they do withhold information. So well, I wouldn't deliberately lie to the other side because I might be found out, but I wouldn't tell them everything. I only tell them so much. So we're not going to get everything, but we try. So there's that. So you've got now preparation, and you've got this gathering information phase. Now, once we've got all the information, we might be in a position to actually start negotiating, or bargaining, if you like. Bargaining, trading, negotiating. In other words, we can start to make proposals and trade one thing off against another. So that's another whole phase. You know, where should we start? What is the first proposal we should make? Should it be A or B or C? And how do we make it? So there's that phase there, which let's just call it bargaining. Now, assuming you reach an agreement through bargaining, there's a process. Then we need to clarify what that agreement is, and it may be that we've been able to maintain clarity throughout. So when we get to that point, both sides say, "Yep, that's the agreement. Here we are. Bang, there we are." My experience is that in most cases, when they get to that point, they think they have an agreement, but when you try and get the agreement, when you try and get it down on paper, it's actually two different agreements. And that was one of the things when I worked as a mediator. You'd often be, you're struggling to reach an agreement, and sometimes you're sitting there quite late at night, and then you seem to get an agreement, and suddenly everyone, because they're so tired, everyone says, "Yes, we've got an agreement. That's great." And then I would say, "Wait, hang on. I said, nobody leaves here alive until they've signed an agreement." Okay. And then I'd start writing the agreement or typing it up or whatever. And when you start writing it out clause by clause, you find, no, that's not what we agreed. You see, now we're into a whole lot more mini negotiations to get it sorted out. And eventually we get it written down, and I'd make them sign it. It was just so important. I mean, I had one I did very late at night, and I thought, I'm not going to get out the computer and type it out, print it. I'm going to do it by hand. So just with my untidy handwriting, I wrote it all out, and eventually we got it all written down. I said, "No, sign it." So both parties signed it, and they went out. 2 weeks later, they were in court because one of them hadn't complied with the agreement. The other side took them to court, and they took it to court, and my little handwritten agreement now is in front of the judge. And the one side saying, "That's not a proper agreement. It's not even typed out." And the judge looked at me and he said, "No, that's a proper agreement. It's legally binding, and you better comply with it." So there's actually getting clarity on what the agreement is. Now, possibly included in that, and there might be another phase, is depending on how complex it is, there might be an implementation plan that has to come as part of that agreement. Because I've had situations where the implementation plan is almost, probably more complicated than the agreement itself. So if if I had one, the local authority agreed to build so many roads and stormwater drains and sewage drains, and so for a community, and this ran into kilometers. This is not just a road down. It's not just the end of the street. We're talking about kilometers. this is a 2-year project, so they have to have a project plan, how it goes out. They have to have what if things go wrong? Is there a dispute procedure? If we reach disagreement, what do we do? So I reckon that sort of covers the whole thing. I might have gone into too much detail there, Martin, but
never mind. So, I mean, let's start at the very beginning. Let's start in the preparation. So, I understand that it's good to gather as much information as possible, but I mean, there can be information overhaul. Obviously, I don't need all information. If I need to prepare, what kind of information am I looking for, and how do I sort it? How do I organize that information to make sense and to enable me to prepare for the negotiation?
The most important thing, I think, is if you can try to see it from the other side's point of view. And that's the big thing I learned as a mediator, because when you're a negotiator, you're sitting on your side of the table and you only see what they want to let you see. When you're a mediator, they let you see. They won't tell, even when you're a mediator, they won't give you everything, but they'll tell you a lot more than they'll tell the other side. So you have more of a helicopter view. And the more that we can get ourselves to look at things that way, the better. And it sounds like really simple, but the problem is, for a seller who's been involved in some sales cycles, it could be 2 years long. So I've been working on this project for 2 years, and I'm getting close to agreement. I've become so the tunnel vision, and I'm just seeing it from my point of view. So one of the things I say to people is try and get a colleague or a friend or someone who's not involved, and just say, if you were the other side, where would you be coming from on this? Try and think it through from their point of view. So try and think, how would they approach it? Now, the key thing to me at this stage is most people are familiar with the book Getting to Yes by Fisher and Urey, which is the highest selling book on negotiation ever written. And I think it first came out in the late 70s, early 80s, somewhere around there. And they talk about a thing called a BATNA, BATNA, which is best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Now, to me, that BATNA tells you a huge amount about the negotiation. So if you think, what is our BATNA? What is the best thing that we can hope to get if this negotiation fails completely? What can we do? And we look at it from their point of view as well. What will they do if this breaks down completely? Now, that tells us, it says to us how many options, what alternatives, what options do we have? If I'm buying a second-hand car, say a small car, a Toyota, let's take a small Toyota, I've got the money, I want to buy the car. I have many, many, many alternatives. So I'm actually in a very strong position. I can go to someone and say, Martin, how much you want for that car? You tell me, and I say, it's too much. I don't even bother to. We don't even have to negotiate. I'll just go down the road to someone else, because there are lots of them available. But it depends on what the alternatives are. So if we're if you're selling, what if you can't get a deal with this customer, what are you going to do? And if it, and if your alternative, if your BATNA doesn't look very good, can you do anything to improve it?
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, you say that I need to consider my BATNA, my best alternative to a negotiated agreement, as well as the counterparty's BATNA. So, for example, if we are preparing for a negotiation, let's say that we are a large computer manufacturing company, and we want to sell a large computer system worth, I don't know, $5 or $10 million to a large energy utility. So my BATNA is how do I utilize my manufacturing capacity as well as people's capacity, right? So that they are not idle, so that they, produce. And the counterparty's BATNA is whether they can buy a similar system from someone else, right?
And frankly, if we're in that situation of selling, our BATNA may be not very attractive. If we don't get a deal with this company, there might not be a similar deal available. So we've got to consider, the company has to consider its strategy. What are we, and that's where company strategy and negotiation strategy come together again. What are we going to do now? Are we prepared to do something else, something different in order to get this business? Or are we prepared to just walk away and put our energy into something else? Because if we have something else that's cooking along here, maybe that's what needs our energy. Maybe we should be putting energy in there now in case this other one goes wrong. So, and the same will apply from the other side.
Yeah. I think Yuri and Fisher, the authors of the Getting to Yes, they write very well that you cannot improve your BATNA during the negotiation process. You need to work on it before you get to the table and then talk about it. But you cannot really improve it during the negotiation, right?
Yeah. It's unlikely. It's unlikely to pick up the phone and just quickly change something. Doesn't work. Life doesn't work like that.
Okay. Is there anything else about the preparation, like collecting data, maybe looking at the data that you would like to highlight?
The rest of the stuff, I think, is logical to most people. In other words, what are we negotiating about? What are the issues? And normally the first one comes up, it's the price. But it's also things like implementation dates, timelines, people, what resources do we put into this thing? If it's a physical resource, how many of these do we supply in a month or whatever it is? All those things. We need to list, what is it we're negotiating about? What are the issues? And again, as I said before, try and see it from their side, because when you see it from their side, there might be issues you don't see from your side. And we've got a list of issues. Now we can start saying, well, where do we realistically think that we could, there must be a range within which we can negotiate. And there's a best and there's a worst. And usually the worst is the easier one to determine, because that's the one at which you have to walk away. So usually the worst is the easier one, and then there's the best. So there's a range, and do these ranges overlap? Because that's one of the things you look at as a mediator. Once you start talking to the two disputing parties separately, and you start getting down, what is the range that they have there, and is there overlap? Because in some instances there's no overlap. What do you do about that? If there's overlap, it's easy, because you could just say to them, look, I think you can reach agreement. I'm going to put you in this room here for an hour. You see if you can reach agreement, and then tell me about it. But the difficulty is if they don't overlap. So it's getting a realistic view. Do we think there's overlap here? Now, to some extent, we're guessing for the other side. And that highlights for us the kind of questions we should be asking when we go into the negotiation, so that we can get some idea. Do we actually have overlap? Is there potential for agreement? Again, this is one of those Harvard or Fisher and Yuri terms. They talk about ZOPA, zone of potential agreement. Is there a zone where there is some overlap? So yes, getting that down. Let's put it this way: if there's something that I can give you that doesn't cost me a lot, but it's worth a lot to you, that's the best possible trade I can make.
I think that so far we have thought about how to prepare for gathering information. So what do I need to gather in advance, and how can I confirm it during the first part of the negotiation, during the information gathering, right? Even confirming the information that I have got from someone else. But I think that now we are getting to preparing for the third part of the negotiation process, which is bargaining, right? Giving concessions. You can also read a lot how it's important to plan how you give your concessions and so on. But what can you advise about that? How can I start? How can I plan for concessions?
Before planning for concessions, I think one has to think about the nature of the proposal that we put on the table. Now, for sellers, there's usually a proposal on the table already, because somewhere a written proposal has been prepared, and that is the proposal that will begin the negotiation. If there isn't a proposal on the table, then we should make one, and that's because I think the behavioral economists have done a lot of work over the last decade or so on this question of anchoring. So and the general rule is, if you have an opportunity to make the first proposal, then make it, because you will then anchor the negotiation rather than letting the other side anchor the negotiation. So it's always a question of, do you ask them to make a proposal, or do you make a proposal? And the general advice, and it's the advice I would stick to, is if you have an opportunity, make the proposal. But also bear in mind for sellers that piece of paper that you send in, that proposal, that's the starting point. And that's really difficult, because as sellers we think, we don't want to for example, take price. We don't make the price too high. We don't want to scare them off. But at the same time, we make it too low. That's where we start negotiating, and we end up with nothing. So we've got to find something that works. So it's quite hard, I think, for sellers to bear that in mind when they're doing a written proposal, and for that reason, we make it a little bit too low, and we make it hard for ourselves.
Yeah. I think that the book Getting to Yes says that you should make the first proposal, the first kickoff, as high as possible that you can justify, right?
Yeah. Not so high that they'll walk away, but high enough where you've got some kind of justification for that. And the other thing is, I don't think it's in Getting to Yes, but it's an area that has been researched, actually, is this thing of proposals should not be in round numbers. So, for example, if you have a price, say it's 50 euros, it would be far better to have 49 euros 74 cents than 50, or 50 euros and 13 cents, or something like that. Because it gives the impression, whether it's correct or not, that you have thought about it and you've come in with a considered position, rather than just saying 50 or 55. And the same when you're talking about concessions, making concessions. You don't want to go from 55 to 50. You know what I mean? We'd rather go from an odd number to another odd number, which makes us think, yeah.
How can I then prepare for the concessions? If there are some things that I can give away, some things that I ask that the counterparty will be asking me to give them, and so on, how shall I plan for the concession and exchange of concessions?
So if you take a particular, we use the example of a timeline. Someone has a particular deadline, and they want it implemented by a particular date. that's probably something they're prepared to, it's high value to them. And if we can give that to them very easily, you see the mistake that sellers often make, and I think it's more sellers that do it than buyers, because sellers they want to be liked. Sellers are always optimistic, and they're enthusiastic about their product, and they want the customer to like them. And so when the customer says, "Can you do this for me?" the tendency is to say, "Yes, of course we can." Whereas if you think of from their point of view, that might be something very important. In other words, having it finished by a particular date. Now, if we were to say to them, if you could give me X, I could make sure that it's implemented by that date. So it's that magic word, if. Can I show you a book? It's called Everything is Negotiable.
Yeah.
Gavin Kennedy. I don't know if you've come across it.
Yeah. I bought it for my Kindle.
Yeah, because I was showing some people the other day the negotiator's most useful 2-letter word, which is if. So he has a whole chapter on the use of if, and I think Kennedy was absolutely right. I think it's one of the key things if someone were to say to me, "Hey, help me, I'm going into a negotiation now. I'm in half an hour I'm going to be negotiating. Give me one thing I need to know." I would say, use if, which means never give anything away unless you get something in return. If you use the word if, it forces you to actually say. So if your sentence has if in it, so if you do that, we'll do this. And as soon as you start using if, you get those trades. But also the back of the mind must think, what is a reasonable trade here? You can't be ridiculous. So if you want them to trade, try and think of it in their terms. What have they got that you really value and might be easy for them to give? And ask for that. If you did this, I could do that. Now that's where win-win comes from. When both sides are thinking, well, I didn't give away a lot, but I got a lot in return. And if both of us walk away like that, well, everyone's happy, and that's a win-win. So I think the if is the key there.
Yeah. Okay. So always exchange. Don't give anything away. I totally agree. And if I could somehow think about ordering the concessions, like the sequence, what shall I ask for the first, and what shall I give the first and the last?
No, I think that's a much more difficult question to answer. You might you might want to think which are going to be the less contentious issues, and we can maybe start with those and then move on to the more difficult ones. So that might be one of the things. The only thing is, nothing is agreed until everything's agreed. That's got to be clear. That you can't agree on something. You can't say, well, let's agree on time, and then we take it off the table. And then we say, let's agree on quantity, and then we take it off the table. Because you'll end up with one thing on the table, be price. And I had that with a mediation once. The party said to me, they said, I mean, you find this hard to believe. They said to me, we've made it easy for you. We've agreed on everything except price. So, when I took them aside and I said to the one side, well, what's your mandate on price? They said X. And on the other side, what's your mandate on price? They said Y. They were miles apart. So what do? There's nothing to trade.
Yeah.
And I said, who gave you this mandate? Oh, our MD gave us the mandate. Right. Give me his phone number. I want to call him. Oh, no, we'll phone him.
So how do you find out what's really important for the other party? Because sometimes they tell it to you. Sometimes they keep it hidden. So how do you find out?
That's that why question.
Okay.
So you're asking them why, but as you say, Martin, they might not want to answer it, and that's why you got to say, yeah, I really need to understand this, or could you just unpack that for me, or something else. Now, Fisher and Urey says, ask them why, and if they won't answer why, ask them why not. And what is meant by that is, if they won't answer your question why, then make them a proposal and let them pull your proposal apart. And by pulling it apart, you will start to understand what the issues are from their side. That's quite complicated. That's quite hard to do. But I think the key to the whole thing is the why, understanding what's behind that. One of the things that you have to consider is how close is the relationship? If you take a spectrum from confrontation to cooperation, and you say to most people, where would you like your negotiation to be? And the most of them will say, oh, we want near the cooperation end and not the confrontation end. But in practice, if you want to be at the cooperation end, there has to be a level of trust. And there has to be enough trust that we can share information. And that might be sensitive information. And that's where the things sometimes go wrong, because there's information there that we don't want to disclose. And then it all gets a bit shaky. So, yeah.
So this is about bargaining. Now let's have a look at the implementation. You said that basically you make a basic agreement, but you also need to put it into writing, ideally in that room with those people, right? And that you expect that there would be many issues in the transfer from the simple oral agreement into the written one. How do you approach it? What advice would you have?
Well, the ideal way is you write it down and you sign it right there and then. That's the perfect way. In reality, especially these days, you'll get the agreement and then the parties will say, oh, well, we need to take this off to our lawyers now. And then it'll be a week with the lawyers and they'll come back with a long agreement. You've got a process of getting the two sides to agree, it's the legal representative of both sides to agree and all that stuff, which just takes so much time. I've done work with a computer company. I've called computer because they do software and hardware, who we used to train these negotiators, and not one of those negotiators was involved in doing the deal. They were people who were doing the implementation, and when these implementations were about 2 years, they recognized that there are going to be many negotiations that happen post-agreement while the thing's being implemented, and so this is what they wanted these people to be trained in, negotiation, so they can negotiate all these little things which are not fully anticipated in the main agreement. Things come up. Life's complicated.
Okay, great, Jan. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your sharing your wonderful knowledge. Thank you.
Jmenuji se Martin Bednář a naučím vás prodávat víc. Máte tipy na témata anebo hosty podcastu o B2B prodeji? Dejte mi vědět na martin@martinbednar.net.